3:11 a.m. My phone vibrated on the nightstand with an alert I didn't know I had set. The Hennepin County recorder notified me that a quitclaim deed transferring a 50% interest in our house had been recorded that afternoon. 2 seconds later, an email from a document service I had used once for flooring subcontract pinned into the same inbox to say my signature had been completed on 3 forms I didn't recognize. I stared at the glare in the dark and watched my name scrawled in a digital cursive I would never use slide across my property record, the arrival time stamped and absolute, like a small, clinical verdict. We live in a 1-story bungalow in Longfellow, a few blocks off Minneapolis Avenue, close enough to hear bikes slip past on the blue painted lanes and the occasional freight moan along the river at night. I run a small flooring and home renovation outfit that straddles hands-on work and e-commerce. Mornings often start with pallets at a warehouse in Egan and end with returns boxed for UPS at the Lake Street drop-off. My wife's schedule gave our life its odd rhythm. She's a clinical lab technologist at Children's Hospital, on shifts that flip between days and overnights, with a professional calm that is almost a performance in itself. We have one kid, a 6-year-old who believes in Lego cities as a form of government. We keep the pantry stocked with his granola bars and the garage with my sample books and a stubborn mountain of scrap. Our finances were always a puzzle we moved around without fully solving. I knew the exact weight of a month, truck payment on the 15th, health insurance premium on the 1st, daycare tuition every other Monday, a credit card statement that arrived at the precision of a metronome. Last year I passed a stone large enough to earn a term bucket anecdote from an anesthetist, and the co-pays rearranged our ledger for months. It wasn't catastrophic, just enough to teach me the ringing clarity of being overdrawn by $19. The house was our stability, modest and low-slung, with a south-facing porch and the kind of maple that drops leaves like a prankster every fall. We stained the floors ourselves the first winter after closing. We talked about replacing the storm windows and argued about backsplash tile. We didn't keep secrets about repairs because the house would tattle for us anyway. A little over a year ago, my wife added a line about a professional certification course and a rotating call schedule to our shared calendar. Her lab sometimes processed stat tests overnight. She would switch out shifts, pick up extra work, she'd swap again. She said she liked the quiet hum of the machines after midnight. There is something seductive about being the person who can handle emergencies without raising her voice, so I didn't question the schedule's relentlessness. I took more morning drop-offs at school and learned the names of crossing guards. My weekdays took on a different drag: early lumber runs to Mendota Heights, a road coffee from Dogwood, podcasts turned too loud in the cab of my truck. Red flags arrive as tiny administrative tasks you ignore. A new password on a phone because of a hospital security update. A new credit card because of a supposed breach at a grocery chain. Then more payments with generic leaf icons, then note fields left blank. When the first envelope from Blue Star Storage showed up among the circulars, I thought it was addressed to the previous owner. The second one had my wife's name, scissored with a little flourish. The postal sorting machines leave when they bite the corner. I asked if we needed a unit for my tools. She said the lab was renovating the break room, and someone had used our address for a piece of equipment sent back to a vendor. It was plausible in the way good lies, just an adjacent truth. The hospital was renovating, and she routinely came home with odd lab lore that needed more context than she had energy to give. I found a key fob I didn't recognize under the driver's seat of her minivan on a Sunday night when I vacuumed out Cheerio drift and playground sand for the new week. It was the kind of dongle apartments use for garage doors. She told me she had parked at her co-worker's building because the hospital's lot had overflowed. She double-checked the address in her head the same way I do when I've guessed and want to sound like I didn't. Our neighbor's jasmine smelled too sweet for October, and her sweatshirt smelled faintly like a men's cologne I couldn't place, the generic sweet woody wash that just says department store counter, nothing memorable enough to pin down. When you are married, you are trained to hand your own brain an explanation and walk away with a big dumb smile like a dog carrying a slipper. I started collecting silence. I set our Wi-Fi doorbell to keep a longer loop than the default, a tiny adjustment in the app that felt like setting a trap for a mouse that might not exist. I refreshed bank apps at odd hours and scrolled past the same transactions until my eyes blurred. I rationalized late mileage in the minute end because the highway skirts in Minneapolis can add 10 to any day if you miss the timing on a merge. If I asked a pointed question, I framed it in the grammar of care, rapid suspicion and concern until the doubt got rubbed off. She would answer with the calm she uses when she's landing a vein. We both acted like adults who understand that sometimes the other person's life is a little beyond explanation. The night of the property alert, I watched the email for a minute without moving, as if the facts might redden and recede like a rash that's not serious. The quitclaim deeds PDF was attached, our parcel number, the legal description, the map that shows our property is a rectangle lit by an alley, the names typed with squared off formality, the notary certification from a UPS store on Lake Street, the little raised seal captured by the scanner like a thumbprint. The signature they had captured for me was slanted and a little ornate, extra loops it don't make. The new joint owner was something called the Lavender Sun Trust. The signatory for the trust was my wife. I timed breaths until the cat flicked her tail against my ankle like accusation's board pointer. I'm a practical person, which is to say that panic is a limit state for me, not a lifestyle. I opened a notebook I use for job estimates and wrote the time down. I opened my credit reports and placed a freeze on all 3 agencies. I called our credit union's 24-hour number and asked the man with the softened night shift force to freeze the headlock we had never used. He seemed surprised that my voice didn't shake when I spelled my last name. Maybe he thought I was calling to cancel a debit card because a bartender had miscounted. He told me to call the recorder's office when the building opened, and he added that he would send an internal alert to the fraud department. I wrote down the case number he gave me, FC-2025-184,733. I took a screenshot. When you're a contractor, you learn to keep your own paper because everybody else's will have coffee poured on it the day you need it. In the morning light, our kitchen looks forgiving. The zest on the granite glows like it never chips. The coffee machine is a small high-pitched orchestra. I packed a lunch for our kid and realized my wife wasn't home yet, which was normal for a night shift, but not normal for a night shift with a fraudulent deed in its mouth. She slid in after 7 as if she had simply re-entered gravity, hair clipped back, badge on a rainbow lanyard, skin dry from hospital air. She leaned against the counter and described a platelet issue from a patient as always, without breaking confidentiality, but with enough general detail to pass as real life. I tried to match the same natural tone when I said I had gotten a weird email from the county and wondered if we'd been part of some blanket scam. She said nothing at all and stared past me at the recycling bin as if it were delivering an opposing argument in a language she hadn't prepared to translate. There was a decisive pause. She said we'd talk later, after sleep, because she didn't want to be cranky about legal stuff. She kissed our son's hair and told him she was proud he had learned to zip his jacket himself. That afternoon I went to the recorder's office on 4th Avenue with a manila folder and a feeling I was playing a part I hadn't rehearsed for. The woman at the window looked at the parcel number on my paper, typed for a second, and printed out 3 pages. The instrument had been recorded the previous day at 3:26 p.m. The notary stamp showed the date, the UPS store's number, and the name Meds. I asked about the signature. She told me notaries certify identity at the time of signing and keep logs, and if I believed the signature wasn't mine, I could file a real estate fraud affidavit and start a process that always takes longer than anyone thinks is rational. She handed me a form that looked like an intake at urgent care. I filled it out at a plastic desk while a man behind me fought with a stapler. When I got home, our house felt occupied by both of us and neither of us. My wife's shoes were by the door, the ones she wears at the hospital because they don't squeak on clean floors. The Blue Star storage envelope was on the counter, torn on the diagonal. I brought my kid's backpack to the table and pretended the normal with an intensity that made me dizzy. After he went to his room to build something out of tiny bricks that would hurt me later when I stepped on it, I opened our main checking account on my laptop and sorted transactions. Sometimes an accounting makes you graceful, sometimes it makes you stare. There were monthly charges to Blue Star Storage, $162.50. There were $2/$300 payments to a credit card I didn't know, issued by a bank we didn't use, categorized automatically as miscellaneous services. There was a $47 charge from a flower shop in Bloomington at 2:10 a.m. 2 weeks earlier. There was a hotel charge at the place in Duluth that I recognized from a post my wife had once liked on social media about the conference. The date lined up with what she had told me, but the receipt amount included room service that was never her style and the second person's breakfast. The first independent confirmation arrived by accident. Our babysitter, Marisol, has never had a poker face. She is a college student who has watched our kid since before he could sit without toppling. She came by to drop off a binder she'd forgotten. In the casual chatter that people think is just words, she asked if we had liked the groceries her friend had helped my wife bring in during a heavy snow a few weeks earlier. I had been in Egan that afternoon, and she had mentioned that a tall man with a silver truck had carried in cases of sparkling water and a sack of flour. She had apologized for stepping on the mat with wet boots. It was detailed and simple, the kind of normal observation that only becomes loaded in hindsight. She saw me register it, and she looked down into the binder as if she had read a sentence out loud in church that shouldn't be said. I asked for a screenshot of the day if she had one, not to dig for gossip, but because my head craved timestamps like a starving person craves salt. She sent me a photo of our kid with a Lego tower that showed the time and date in the corner, the lock screen style time the phone stamps on a live photo. In the reflection of a window, barely, the outline of a pickup cab was visible. It could have been mine if the angle had matched, but my truck was in Egan. I thanked her and told her I appreciated her being careful with details. She said she hadn't told anyone anything, and I believed her because she wasn't dramatic enough to concoct a role in a marriage. On the 3rd day after the deed alert, a letter from the credit union arrived confirming my fraud report and the HELOC freeze. The letterhead had a case number that matched my notes. It felt like something very official had entered the story, as if a referee had blown a whistle in a sport with no lines. That same afternoon, I opened a separate checking account at a different bank. I routed the ACH deposits from my flooring supplies and a small e-commerce platform I use for selling trim tools. I sat in my truck after the banker printed the temporary checks and watched the people in the next car share a muffin without breaking a crumb in the wrong place. I froze our joint credit cards and left a single grocery card active. It's astonishing how administrative cruelty can be so quiet, a little click on a website that says disable, and a whole pattern of living shifts under your feet. I told my wife what I had done in a simple, declarative list. I told her I had filed the real estate fraud affidavit and given my statement to the bank's fraud investigator. I told her I had opened a separate account and rerouted business deposits. I told her we would need to sit down together with a lawyer, not because I wanted a scene, but because I wanted her signature in front of a person whose job is to glance at forgery and see it. She said very little, then went quiet for 3 hours that might have been sleep. When she emerged, she said it was a misunderstanding and I was overreacting because the trust was a vehicle for estate planning she had set up for taxes. I asked why my name on a deed needed to be moved into a trust with someone else's trustee signature without telling me. She asked why I was acting like a policeman in my own house. It's astonishing how quickly an accusation can recast your care as surveillance. I told her I was done debating hypotheticals. I printed the deed, the notary stamp, the bank letter, the storage charges, the Duluth receipt, and the little flower shop line. I slid them into a folder that I labeled like a job permit. I told her I wanted to see the storage unit. She said that was fine and that she would take me. I said I wanted to go now, while the evidence of our lives was still honest. She said she was too tired, and I said I was going alone and that Blue Star would let me in because my name was on the lease. She looked surprised in a way people do when they realize you have been paying attention in a class they assumed you were dozing through. Blue Star storage sits in an industrial stretch by high water. The unit's painted a corporate blue that tries to be cheery about things people don't want to talk about. My wife had used our address and my phone number for the account, so when I walked in and gave the desk clerk my information, he handed me a temporary code to the gate without flinching. The unit number was scribbled on a post-it and stuck to the back of a card in a file. I keyed the code and heard the little buzz of permission. The metal door rattled up with the sound I've come to associate with self-inflicted wounds. Inside, there were neat rows of bankers' boxes, labelled with an efficiency that would be admirable if it weren't terrifying. There was a second-hand dresser with the top drawer ajar. There was a cheap plastic safe with a code keypad and a key override taped to the underside. I opened the safe with the key like I had rehearsed it. Inside were things that shouldn't live together. A P.O. box key with a label from a downtown postal unit. A gold credit card with my wife's name embossed and an extra card in the envelope for an authorized user named Jared L., a name I recognized from a group photo she had shown me once of co-workers at a hiking event. A Verizon envelope with a secondary phone number and the last 4 digits that matched an unknown missed call on the day of the flower purchase. A ring box with a simple band I couldn't place. A binder that said a Foundation Wellness LLC on a printed cover sheet with articles of organization filed in a different county, using an address I didn't recognize and a business bank account number with a balance written on a sticky note. Under the binder, there were 2 ultrasound printouts with dates that matched the Duluth weekend. My hands did not shake, which is something I now understand about shock. Sometimes it steadies you like a brace. There were paper receipts from the UPS store notary desk. The signature in the notary's log would be discoverable. The clerk had written ID verified next to my wife's name. On a shelf, there was a stack of gift cards, a handful of unused SIM cards, a pack of grey t-shirts still plastic wrapped, and a box of holiday ornaments I recognized from our attic. In the dresser, there were 2 hoodies that were not my size and smelled faintly like a gym I don't go to, a particular mix of rubber and eucalyptus that boutique places atomized the creative vibe. There was also a card from a lawyer, a family law specialist in Edina, folded around a single business card with a handwritten appointment date 2 weeks earlier. It was all so ordinary in its mess that a part of my brain asked if I was making a scene out of a yard sale. The timeline arranged itself in my head like floorboards fitting into place. I took pictures of every item, every label, every corner. I did not take anything. I wanted no accusation of theft to muddle the clean line of what I had seen. I closed the door and memorized the clunk of the lock. On the way out, a man carried a lamp past me and nodded as if moving a life from one place to another were the most common afternoon errand in the world. That night, I wrote a 1-page notice that I slid across the kitchen table. It was not angry. It was legal. It listed the actions I had taken: credit freeze, HELOC freeze, separate checking, cancellation of joint discretionary cards, appointment with a real estate attorney for the following Tuesday at 10:30 a.m. It stated clearly that I was requesting a DNA test for our son through an accredited lab, not because I doubted his belonging in my life but because I had discovered evidence of a long deception and needed facts under my feet. I cited the Minnesota statute that allows a parent to petition for testing and added that I would schedule the collection at the neutral clinic in St. Paul. I put a date, the following Friday. I added the sentence that I would not involve law enforcement regarding the deed until after the appointment with the real estate attorney. It was a boundary written in black ink. On Saturday, my in-laws hosted a family dinner in Edina. It had been scheduled weeks before, a post-birthday thing for our son with lasagna and the kind of cake that makes kids' tongues blue. We went because life is a machine that keeps moving until you throw a crowbar into the gears. The back deck was full of neighbors in sweaters. A college football game murmured from a TV inside, and people made the polite noises about how big kids get between Septembers. I took the manila folder out of the turp bag my wife always teases me about for looking like a courier and set it on the table. It's funny how a folder can insist on its own gravity. My wife watched me with that look I had always taken as detachment and suddenly understood as calculation. I waited until the paper plates were down to crumbs. I said I needed to share something with the family because it involved the house and our son, and because it would be better if people heard one sequence of facts. There was no speech. I narrated the documents the way I would walk a building inspector through a subfloor. Recorded Quitclaim deed, date and timestamp, notary, trust name. Fraud case number from the bank, recorded and active. Blue Star storage invoices, 3 months, paid by a card I didn't recognize. Duluth hotel receipt, line items, not just lodging. Flower shop charge at 2:10 a.m. The authorized user card with someone else's name. The ultrasound images. The binder for a company formed without my knowledge in a different county, with a business account number and a mailing address at a PO box I didn't have a key to until I had opened the safe. My father-in-law is the kind of man whose voice usually fills a room. He looked at the notary stamp and asked me if I was sure there wasn't a tax reason to move a property into a trust. I said that if there was a legitimate estate planning reason, it had been executed with a forgery rather than a conversation. My mother-in-law reached for my wife's hand and looked at her with the expression I've watched her use on broken ornaments since we started dating. Our son asked if there was more cake. Our neighbor from next door, a man named Greg, who always knows when the plow will come and often texts me warnings about alternate side parking, stepped closer and stared at the ultrasound printouts with his head tilted like a carpenter reading a slope. He said he had seen a silver Tacoma parked beside our house at 3:40 a.m. last month on trash night and had thought nothing of it until he had our door closed and saw a figure hurry down the steps. He thought it was me. He realized now it wasn't because the man's shoulders were broader and the gait was wrong. It was the first independent witness, unsolicited and embarrassing in its plainness. My wife said very little. She fixed her eyes on the fence where the shadow of a birch made a pattern and said she had been dealing with a private medical issue and had been afraid I wouldn't be supportive, so she had used a friend for rides and help, and the trust was a temporary protection for the house because she thought my business risk might threaten our home if I got sued. I tried to hold my face in a shape that could accommodate her logic. A lie attached to a kernel of risk feels generous when you're exhausted. My industry does carry liability, but our LLC and insurance are not imaginary. I asked her if the private medical issue involved an ultrasound in Duluth. I asked her if it involved a man with a name embossed on her card. I asked her why a notary at a UPS store had my name slanted like someone practicing. Our child played with a balloon, oblivious. I could feel my in-laws' neighbors sliding backward into their own kitchens, unwilling to be named as witnesses to something that was about to be a story even if we tried to keep it a secret. I told my in-laws I would send them PDFs because people think more clearly when they can zoom in on a screen without other eyes around. And then I said the sentence I had practiced. I would be staying on the couch in the living room for a while and would expect my wife to find a place to sleep elsewhere until our appointment with the attorney. I had already started looking for a short-term rental for her near the hospital so childcare wouldn't turn into collateral damage. It was the smallest of mercies. It looked, I suspect, like a punishment. That night, the UFI captured our porch in its circular eye. It records in clean rings of time, 30-second increments that make life feel like half-remembered experiments. At 11:48 p.m., my wife walked out with a duffel. At 11:49, she turned back for the charger she always forgets. At midnight, the porch light burned a reminder that life was still functioning in a house that had just lost a shape. The following week was a set of administrative knots. The lawyer in Edina explained, after listening quietly for 20 minutes, that the trust could be unwound if the deed were proven to be forged and that the presence of notarization complicated everything while also offering a bright path to proving fraud because notary logs exist to provide exactly that. He said he would send a letter to the notary and request the logbook. He said he would send a demand letter to the trustee of the Lavender Sun Trust. He asked me if I wanted to involve law enforcement now or later. I said later, after the meeting and after the DNA test. He took out the calendar and wrote our next appointment in a hand that looked like a doctor's, all loops and slant. At the clinic in St. Paul, a nurse swabbed cheeks and sealed envelopes with a gravity that made me feel like a bad version of a television show about science. I told my son it was a fun experiment. He asked if this swab was like the Q-tips. I won't let him jam in his ears. The lab tech handed me a receipt with a case number and a timeline. 3 to 5 business days, it said, as if a person could categorize a universe by the rhythm of banking. On the way home, I noticed the mileage on the minivan was 200 miles higher than it should have been for a typical hospital commute plus school duty. The engine smelled warm in a way that meant it was fine but had been driven longer than I'd predicted. The little details pile like leaves. I pulled our son's electronic medical portal and scrolled through vaccinations and school physicals and the little red flags that mean nothing unless you're looking. I noticed that his blood type, recorded during a routine lab when he was 2, was AB. Mine is O, my wife's is A. The nurse at the pediatrician had mentioned it casually once in reference to transfusion considerations. I had filed it in the drawer labeled Things the Body Says. I looked at the chart again and realized what I hadn't done then: simple arithmetic with biology. Combinations are not limitless. The arithmetic wasn't definitive by itself without knowing her genotype, but it began to write a probability in my head that I didn't know how to live with. On Thursday, the babysitter texted me a paragraph written like a person who has rehearsed testifying without practicing. She said she had been asked by my wife to cover a few afternoons when my wife was supposedly at a training off-site. She listed the dates and times. She said my wife had always paid in cash those days instead of the usual Venmo, and the cash had smelled faintly like a candle store. She said she had no idea what any of it meant and didn't want to be involved in any way that would make our kid look at her differently. I took a screenshot and put it in a folder on my desktop that I had named House. That's how my brain now categorized this, not as a marriage inside me but as a building I had to document for insurance. I sent my wife a second notice when the DNA lab confirmed the appointment was complete and I had a ticket number for results, a time-stamped email that stated the lab's location, a case ID, and the expectation that we would both abide by whatever schedule they provided for pickup or delivery of results. I said it was in the child's interest that we reduce the speculation and stick to the administrative steps. She replied 2 hours later with a single line from her work email address saying she had received my communication. It is a particular kind of loneliness to get acknowledgement as if you are a vendor. On Friday night, I sat in the living room with the TV on mute and scrolled through the doorbell app. At 5:32 a.m. on a Wednesday 2 weeks earlier, the camera had captured motion. The figure on the porch was my wife. She moved fast, with the white duffel I recognized from the storage unit, and drove away in a minivan in the pre-dawn dark. Her shift that night, according to the shared calendar, had ended at 7 a.m., but according to the doorbell she had been at our house before dawn, which only made sense if she had not been at the hospital the whole night or if she had been with someone in the hours before. I pulled her hospital time card app up on my phone. I knew her password once the hospital had forced a change, and I had watched her type it that afternoon without meaning to memorize it. The time card showed clock in and clock out that matched the posted schedule. HR systems can be as creative as the people who use them. I would later learn from a coworker, a woman I barely knew who found me by way of a mutual contractor, that my wife had swapped part of her shift that night to another technologist and stayed in a building as a resource, which meant she had the freedom to leave the bench for stretches. She had used the lab's QR entry to clock out and back in, a trick people use when they are not trying to hide anything until later. It's remarkable how a system built to count can help someone disappear. On Saturday, I took our kid to Lake Nokomis to throw a ball and grind out time in a way that looked like parenting. He ran and fell and cried and then laughed like children do when they are negotiating with gravity. He asked why Mom wasn't there. I said she had to work. I felt my face reorganize itself and hoped he couldn't read it because kids read faces like they are the only books that matter. The DNA results arrived on a Wednesday. The subject line looked like a marketing email. I opened it in the truck outside a supplier in Egan where I had been picking up tobacco-coated glue that finally arrived in a crate that looked too serious for adhesive. I entered the case number and my birth date and a password the lab had generated that felt juvenile. PDF loaded, and I saw the word that cut across my chest like a saw goes across an old plank: probability of paternity of 99.999%. My son is mine. The arithmetic had been a scare with a narrative I had written to educate myself into despair. I sat with the paper in the truck and cried like a person who was angry at himself for the chemistry he doesn't control. In the oddest twist, the clarity didn't make anything else easier. It made the stakes higher, in focus, like a lens cleaned properly for the first time all week. I forwarded the result to my wife with a line that said I have received it and that it would be provided to the attorney's office. I told the attorney too. He replied to both of us with a formality that felt like a blessing and a reprimand, receipt acknowledged, next steps unchanged. That same day, the notary provided the log and the copy of the ID used at the desk. The signature in the log did not match mine. The ID used was a passport card in my name with my birth date and a photo that was not me. The attorney's email called it plainly an identity misrepresentation attached to a notarized instrument, a phrase that is both elaborate and crystal clear. He added that the notary had followed protocol and captured what looked like valid ID, which would keep the notary out of the legal line of fire and shift the focus to the person who procured false identification and executed the forgery. At some point, words like forged identity indeed stopped being thrilling and become disgusting. I filed the police report because the attorney told me the fraud affidavit would be strengthened by a registered complaint and an incident number. The officer at the desk was kind in the way city employees who deal with human wreckage every day sometimes are. She printed the incident number out and told me to keep my phone on me. I walked to the truck feeling like a person in a movie who doesn't realize he's the background extra in a scene he thought he was starring in. The day the attorney sent the demand letter to unwind the trust, my wife moved into a short-term rental near the hospital. She said it was for proximity to work. I saw the convenience of an alibi, but I also saw the simplicity of a smaller space where she could pretend to be a person without a family. She asked via email for a schedule with our son and suggested days. I replied with times. We stuck to logistics. It felt like running a high-conflict job where two subcontractors refuse to be on site together and you create a calendar to keep their egos from colliding. A coworker of my wife's called me anonymously from a number that showed up on the Verizon envelope from the storage unit. She said she had avoided getting involved, but the lies had seeped from work into home, and she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen things. She said my wife had been using a breakroom couch as a staging area to change outfits on nights when she wasn't fully on shift. She said a silver Tacoma had become a familiar presence on late nights, parked just off the camera in the staff lot. She said the man was a sales rep for a lab supply company, handsome in a catalogue way that made her roll her eyes, and that he had offered to consult on the hospital's workflow in a way that felt too enthusiastic. She said she had heard the man's name and that it matched the embossed card. This was the independent witness I hadn't expected to get, the worst kind, because I had to hear it from someone who spoke softly into a phone like a person ordering their conscience over the counter. The Rep's face appeared in my head the way a protagonist forms when you click on a show you don't plan to watch and end up binging. He had the jaw that sells filtration systems. He had the confidence that buys lunches. He had access to the spaces my wife lives in when she's not at home. He had business cards and a plausible reason to text at odd hours. I had a toolbox and receipts. It felt like the setup to a humiliating fable. The lawyer's next letter laid out consequences like a laminated policy on a wall. If the trust was not unwound voluntarily within 10 business days, we would file a suit to quiet title and ask for fees. If the person who executed the deed using my forged signature did not come forward, the matter would be referred to the county attorney with the notary log and the passport card copy. The bank's fraud investigators would continue their process. The authorized user card would be grounds for separate civil action if used to transact with marital funds for non-marital purposes, documented via statements and receipts. The letter ended with a sentence that I have since memorized and sometimes recite to myself in the shower. In light of the minor child's interests, we expect the parties to maintain a stable routine, and any attempt to interfere with the child's relationship with either parent will be documented for the court. My wife replied 2 days later with a document from a family law firm I recognized from the card in the storage unit. It proposed a temporary separation agreement and a friendly tone that felt like perfume in a house fire. It suggested that she keep the house in trust while I paid my share of the mortgage to the trust account. It suggested we share custody with a schedule that gave her weekdays and me alternating weekends. It suggested we avoid escalation because the community would suffer if our private matter became public. The words were arranged to appear generous, but functionally to strip me of the house and the weeknights with my son. I printed it and brought it to the attorney, who circled phrases with a pen and laughed once in a small Excel that had no joy in it. We sat with the document and wrote another boundary drawn like a map. I would not deposit anything into an account controlled by a trust set up using a forged deed. I would continue paying the mortgage to the lender directly, with receipts. I would not cede weekdays with my son based on the convenience of someone else's shift schedule, especially after a month in which those shits had been a costume. I would track my hours with my son in a calendar and keep a log of meals and school pickups and extracurriculars, not because I intend to weaponize them, but because administrators ask for numbers and not feelings. The attorney filed a petition for a judge to establish a temporary parenting schedule based on the status quo of the last year, not the last week of convenient plans. Bureaucracy is therapy for people who have lost a certain kind of faith. When did I disengage from the part of me that wants to preserve a particular story about our marriage? There wasn't one moment. It was the slow drip of administrative tasks into my brain, a kind of cognitive water torture that rewired me. I began to see our relationship in the same way I see a decaying subfloor, not as a moral failing but as a material problem with rot you have to cut out and replace with something that doesn't flex under a refrigerator. I inventoried the house like a claims adjuster. I changed the passwords on the cameras and set EFI to send clips automatically to an email account she doesn't have. I kept the living room couch as my temporary residence and made the bed every morning like a man performing for an invisible judge. I drank coffee at the same hour as I always do, even if I hadn't slept. My work never stopped because bathrooms still need tile and people still want their floors finished before the holidays. Some readers would ask, if they could interrupt me without quote marks, why I didn't throw everything into a dumpster and move to a studio with a mattress on the floor, eat tacos, and reboot. I thought about it. Sometimes I still do. But there is a kid who believes that certain Lego figures have jurisdiction over other Lego figures and that reality trumps any fantasy I have about uncomplicated grief. The notary came through with an important detail. The person who had presented the passport card had also signed a separate document at the counter, a rental agreement for safe deposit at a small bank I had never noticed on our drives. The card had captured a serial number. The attorney used that to issue a request to the bank for the access logs. The log showed entries on 2 nights that lined up with our camera footage of my wife leaving the house at odd hours. It is astonishing how many systems a person has to cooperate with to keep a story going. Every cooperation creates another witness, and witnesses don't know they are part of a play until the curtain jerks. The paternity result changed one axis of the system. My wife, having seen the PDF, sent a carefully constructed message suggesting we could reset and rebuild trust for our son's sake. She recommended counseling and a path forward. I read the words and felt irritation because I recognized my own phrases from arguments in the past reflected back as if they were hers. I chose a sentence that avoided both self-righteousness and surrender. I said that trust requires a ground truth, and ground truth had been obliterated by a series of actions with paper trails. I said that I would attend counseling on my own and consider sessions together, but that the legal processes would continue, and the physical separation would too, until the deed issue, the storage unit, the separate business, and the authorized user card had been resolved not by promises but by documented reversals. I had wondered if the man himself would ever enter the stage in a way that wasn't through receipts and second-hand accounts. He did, in the most American way. A hospital HR email came into the shared inbox because my wife had never unsubscribed our family address from her notifications. It contained a memo about vendor access. It listed 3 reps whose access had been temporarily suspended pending review. His name was on it. I realized then that the boundaries between a person's work life and their private misadventures are illusions when they run out of hinges to hang on. My wife must have felt the walls coming at work. I heard later from the coworker that he had been escorted politely to a lobby where he stood looking like the cover of his own pamphlet while a manager shook his hand with the kind of tightness that means both a goodbye and a please leave without making me call security. I should have felt vindicated. I felt dull. Sunday night, the pastor from our in-law's church left a voicemail on my phone because my mother-in-law had given him my number. He said he wanted to provide support in this time of betrayal. I erased it because I'm ironically private in a way that sabotages me. I went to Target for school snacks and bought the wrong kind, and my son looked at me as if I had failed an important test, which was correct, and I told him we would get the right kind in the morning. There's a long way between a thin legal victory and the sound a kid makes when he doesn't get the gummy worms he expected. Over the following weeks, our house became an object in a chain of custody. The attorney amended trust with a combination of stern letters and the notary log. The deed was reversed by stipulation, not by a judge's order, which meant faster undoing and less theatre. My wife's separate company, the LLC with the binder in the storage unit, was dissolved, the bank account was closed, and the authorized user card was cancelled with a letter that made me want to eat paper. It was so bureaucratic and so relieving. The storage unit contract was ended. The items inside were delivered to a short-term rentals office because I refused to ferry them myself. The notary log and the passport card copy went to the county attorney's office with the case file. I made a statement, and the attorney made it clear to me that the county may never prioritize a case like this over the violent emergencies that dominate the docket, but the file exists with an incident number in a system that hums at night. Whether a prosecutor ever taps it is a different question. I wrote a list on my fridge titled Boundaries and Consequences because I needed my future self to honor my present self. It said, no joint accounts until we have a court order establishing property control. No lending of tools, truck, or business relationships to someone who moved a house into a trust behind my back. No conversation about reconciliation outside a counselor's office with a calendar appointment and a receipt. No phrases like for the child used to bulldoze reasonable adult caution. If either of us misses a school pickup, we document the reason in the shared calendar, not to collect points but to avoid gaslighting about who did what when. I looked at it every morning and sometimes tapped it with my finger like a coach tapping a playbook before a scrimmage. There were small kindnesses. Our neighbor Greg mowed the strip of grass between our driveways on a day I ran late to a job. Marisol left a note with a drawing of a Lego figure holding a swab, and I laughed like an idiot. My father-in-law sent an email that said he didn't understand everything but that he respected the way I was handling it, and I cried in a truck in the parking lot of a Home Depot I had been to 900 times without feeling any particular emotion about a parking lot. The first counseling session turned out to be less dramatic and more clinical than I expected. The therapist had a way of asking my wife questions that sounded like paperwork, and my wife answered them as if she were completing a continuing education quiz. The therapist then asked me to describe what I needed in order to stay married, not because she assumed I would, but because she wanted the shape drawn even if nobody would walk that path. I said I needed 3 years without lies, an accounting I could audit, and one more job I could describe as family in a tone that didn't sound like a man begging a contractor to show up on time. I said I needed an apology that had nouns in it, not adjectives. The therapist nodded and said that was the kind of language a judge would appreciate, which made me wonder if I had simply moved my heart permanently into a courthouse. I cannot summarize a month with words that make anyone feel triumphant. Our son adjusted in a way kids do, which is to say he bounced hard and then remained inexplicably elastic. He likes the short-term rental because it has a weird lamp shaped like a crescent moon. He likes my couch because I let him eat toast on it when he is sick. He does not care about propriety. He cares about bedtimes and snacks. He asked me once if we had to move like his Lego police station did after the bad guy escaped, and I said no, not for now, and that for now was the most honest phrase I had to give a child. One afternoon, I picked him up early for a pediatrician appointment because he had had a cough that wouldn't quit. The nurse asked about family medical history in the way they do and then paused because she saw the note in the chart about the paternity test and how we had requested that certain emergency contacts be updated. She asked me if we needed to list anyone else or if the default would do. I said the default would do. I realized that default is an underrated word. The in-laws held a second dinner a month later. Fewer neighbors came. My wife looked like a person who sleeps but not well. She has not admitted anything that would satisfy a person who collects admissions, and I have stopped asking for dramatic confessions because I have the receipts and the deeds and the logs and the case numbers, and the theatre of hearing someone say what you already know is overrated. We talked about our son's school project about autumn leaves. We talked about hosting Thanksgiving. We did not talk about the trust because it is gone among like a measuring tape that had been stretched across a room that no longer needs measuring. On the nights when the house feels too quiet, I make lists. I write down things like, check furnace filter, schedule truck oil change, confirm that the UFI is still capturing 30-second clips and forwarding them to the right place. I write a sentence to myself that says I'm not the sum of someone else's planning documents. I write another that says I am capable of being boring and faithful and careful, and that this is not a personality flaw. I write one question I can't resolve. Do I hold the line on counseling and legal steps and stick with this marriage for the child's daily life, or do I accept that whatever was broken deserves a marker and move us to 2 homes with cheerful lumps and fewer obligations? Would you put the money and the paperwork in the custody schedule on the scale and measure it against the quiet hum of a house that stops lying? I do not have a neat ending yet. The county attorney's office has my file. The bank has closed the loop on the Helloc freeze and put a note on our account that makes the teller nod twice when I deposit checks. The notary's log exists in a folder on my desktop next to photos of my son with a swab and a grin. The storage unit is emptied but for a ghost smell of cedar sachets that reminds me of a boutique gym I never joined. The authorized user card is cancelled, the account is closed. The vendor's access is suspended. Trust is unwound, the deed is restored. The house's floors are still the ones we stained, and our kid still runs a plastic police station like a benevolent tyrant. Last night I stood on the porch at 3:11 a.m. because my body woke me up without asking permission. The UFI's blue ring pulsed once because it recognized me and decided not to alert itself. The street was quiet except for a distant train and the Morse code of a sprinkler system a few doors down. I looked at the spot where Greg said the silver truck had idled and tried to picture it as a joke someone told poor Lee. I thought about the night I first saw my name slanted into a deed and the way the alert made the room feel like a stage. I took a photo of the porch light because I wanted a visual memory of the house being exactly what it was in that second. A rectangle of light on concrete, a soft hum of a refrigerator inside, a line of bikes leaning against a wall, a pair of shoes I should have moved before I tripped. I don't know if this image will be a haunting reminder or a small mercy later, but I know it matched the opening beat and I know that mattered to me.